Here's the JVC LS300. In this video, I'm going to talk about 5 things I like about this camera and 5 things I don't like about this camera. This isn't my everyday workhorse camera, but there are certain things about it that are just phenomenal and are unlike any other camera that is out there right now. So the first thing I really love about this camera is the variable scan mapping. The VSM sensor, that's what they call it. I'm going to make an entire video on just this feature, so I'll breeze through this topic in this video, but in another video I'm going to go in depth with it. The VSM sensor allows you to adjust the angle of view of the Super 35 sensor. This is a Super 35 sensor. So you're able to adjust the angle of view from Super 35 all the way to HD. And you also have sensor zooming. You have a zoom rocker here that if you shoot in HD, HD is only a fraction of the size of a Super 35 sensor. So what you're able to do here is electronically zoom in from that Super 35 to an HD size sensor. And it looks organic, it looks optical, it does not look electronic. So what that means is you're able to mount pretty much any lens on this camera and adjust the angle of view of the sensor to match that lens. The second thing I like about this camera is its active micro four thirds mount. So even though it's a Super 35 sensor, the mount is micro four thirds. That means you can put in a Lumix lens or a Olympus lens and be able to control the autofocus, the image stabilization, the iris, whatever you can control electronically with the Panasonic or Olympus camera, you can control electronically with JVC. The third thing I like about this camera are all the frame rates I can shoot. You can get UHD 4K at 422 8-bit at 60, 30, and 24 frames, all at 150 megabits per second or 70 megabits per second. All of those flavors are in a QuickTime wrapper, .mov, and they shoot onto SD cards, dual SD cards, and not the expensive SD cards. These are the UHS-1 Class 3 cards. You can also shoot Cinema 4K at 150 megabits, Cinema 2K at 50 megabits, and 422 HD at 50 megabits at 60, 30, and 24 frames, which I believe are all broadcast quality codecs. You can also shoot at AVCHD, which is the most compressed codec, but generally shooting QuickTime is amazing because it's so easy to edit and play back on your computer. The fourth thing I like about this camera are all the outputs. You get a full HDMI output, an HD-SDI output right underneath it, and then you also get a USB host that can, with a streaming dongle, Wi-Fi, you can stream. Now the HDMI is the only connection that will give you a 4K out. The HD-SDI is only HD, but you can have all of these options if you're in the studio or if you're a YouTuber, if you're streaming. It's all in one camera. And the fifth thing I like about this camera is the price. This is a $2,000 to $2,500 camera depending on where you're shopping. So as far as price value goes, I don't think you'll find a better deal than this JVC LS400. Now here are 5 things I don't like about this camera. The first one is, although the sensor is Super 35, the low light capabilities of the camera aren't very good. The second thing I don't like about this camera is the body. The body is where you realize all the cost cutting that JVC most likely went through to bring the price of this camera down. It's a very flimsy, cheap, hollow camera. I doubt it's weather sealed. The LCD screen is pretty flimsy, and when you press on it, it moves. It's low resolution LCD and EVF. There's also no 3.5mm audio input, so even though you can take out the handle with the XLR, once you take that out, there's no jack to plug in external audio. And just all the buttons, they don't feel very tactile and they don't feel good. The third thing I don't like about this camera are the picture profiles. Now this camera can shoot log, which is JVC's version of log, and shooting log isn't that bad. Actually, shooting their J-log looks very nice when your scene is lit properly. But the J-log does not have that much dynamic range when you compare it to Canon C-log, and then the S-log with Sony, and then the V-log with Panasonic. The J-log if you nail the exposure, it's good and it's really beautiful, but if it's not that flexible. And the other picture profiles actually look terrible. Those picture profiles look like HDV from 10 years ago. It's not a good looking a cinematic image quality with their picture profiles. And it's also quite difficult to intercut when you're using other cameras, especially Canon. So if you have a bunch of Canon cameras and you're trying to intercut it with JVC, that might be next to impossible. Maybe with Sony and Panasonic with heavy color correction, you might be able to match the cameras, but once you shoot JVC multicam, you need to stick with JVC. The fourth thing I don't like about this camera is that even though you have an active Micro Four Thirds mount, the autofocus is quite slow, and there's no face detection. So the autofocus, when you're shooting run and gun, sometimes you have to use autofocus, and it's great that you have the auto mount MFT, but it's quite unreliable. And then when you go into manual focus, because the LCD and the EVF have very low resolution, it's hard to tell what's in focus and what's out of focus. I was on a shoot where I was using peaking, and everything was in red, and it looked really sharp to me in the viewfinder and on the LCD. When I brought it into my computer, I was off. The focus was not sharp, and I couldn't tell just by the LCD screen. So I would have had to have used, or I should have used, an external monitor for focus aids. And then the fifth thing I don't like about this camera is that the menu system is quite clunky. It's really different from all other manufacturers. And it's once you click on certain buttons, it takes a while for the camera to process, especially when you turn the camera on and off. When you turn the camera on, it takes a while to boot up. So it's not the fastest documentary event camera to use. You would have to be in a really controlled studio environment. That's probably the best way to use this camera. But if you're run and gun, if you're event, if it's a documentary where you don't know what the location or the lighting is going to look like, if it's sports, if you're travel, if you're any of those situations, this camera is not that good. So that's why over the years that I've had it, I've only used it when I'm in the studio or if I'm in a sit-down interview where I know I can control all the lighting. That's when I bust this camera out, and then when I shoot JLog, it looks beautiful. But to get that, there's a lot of work involved. It's worth it for the price. I like to hold on to this camera because of the VSM sensor, which I'll get into in another video. I use this camera to test lenses. So when I'm buying a bunch of lenses on eBay, and I'm buying maybe a Super 16 film lens, I can pop them on this camera with an adapter and to test to see how sharp that lens is. So that's all good with this camera. Those are the 5 things I like and don't like.